The old fire had been dead for 200 years, and I had stopped praying for it to wake. That was the first honest thing I let myself think as I stood at the edge of the silver ground and watched two champions try to break each other on the frozen stone. Snow ringed the trial ground in a high white wall, banked by the boots of 1,000 watchers, and above us the midwinter moon hung so bright it laid a second, colder day across the field. In the center of that field stood the Rite basin, a shallow bowl of black stone older than Dunkero itself, older than my line, older than the packs who had come to fight in front of it. Once, the song said, it had blazed silver when the true Luna crossed it. Once, it had chosen. Now it was only a cold cup of stone that held a handful of snow, and the men bleeding beside it were bleeding for nothing but a crown of laurel and the right to say they had one. Choose by moonrise, my council had told me that morning, and they had not been asking. I was the alpha king of the Greywater packs, and I had no Luna, and a king with no Luna is a house with no roof. For 3 winters I had put them off. For 3 winters the great packs had sent me their daughters, proud, lovely, sharp-eyed women who curtsied to my throne and measured the weight of my kingdom in a glance, and I had bowed over each hand and felt nothing, and sent each of them home with an honor gift and an empty answer. My people were patient. My people were also afraid, because a realm without a bound Luna is a realm the neighbors watch the way wolves watch a limping deer. So they had built this, the champion's trial, 3 days of the finest fighters in the north, and at the end of it I was to look out over the packs assembled and name the woman I would make my queen. They had chosen a trial because they no longer trusted the right to choose for us. Neither did I, but there is a stubbornness in old blood, and some worn-down corner of me had wanted the fire lit anyway, had wanted the basin filled and tended and ringed with lamps as it had been in my grandfather's grandfather's time, as if by honoring the dead thing I could shame it back to life. So the basin sat there through the fighting, cold and dark, and every hour that passed with it dark was another hour the whole realm remembered that the gods had gone quiet on us long ago. Below me, the taller champion caught the smaller one by the shoulder and threw him down onto the ice, and the crowd roared, and I did not watch the men. I watched the woman at the far edge of the ground, kneeling in the trampled snow beside the last fighter who had fallen. I did not know her name. I had noticed her the way you notice a steady flame in a room full of guttering ones, not for brightness, but for the way it did not waver. All around the trial ground the great packs preened in their furs and their feud colors, their champions strutting, their daughters watching me from beneath jeweled hoods to see which way my eyes would turn. And through all of it, this one woman moved low and quiet at the field's rim, going wherever a man went down, kneeling in the red slush without any care for her plain gray wool, setting bones and binding wounds with hands that never once hurried and never once shook. She wore no pack's color. She wore no color at all. She was a camp healer, one of the nameless who follow the fighting and stitch what the fighting tears, and not one soul in that roaring crowd of thousands had looked at her twice. I could not stop looking at her. I told myself it was a king's habit, that I was simply watching the one competent thing in a field full of vanity. But my wolf, who had been silent and sullen through 3 winters of proud strangers, had lifted its head the first time she crossed my sight, and had not lowered it since. It made no sound. It only stood there behind my ribs, alert and quiet, the way a hound stands when it hears, far off, a footstep it has been waiting its whole life to hear. Sire, Havar, my captain and my oldest friend, came up beside me with snow in his beard. Bale of the Iron Reach has won his bracket. He'll want you to see him crowned. Let him win it then, I said. I'm watching. Havar followed my gaze across the field, and I saw him find the tall champion, and nod, because of course he thought I meant the men. Bale's the strongest fighter to come out of the north in a generation, he said. His father's already sent word. If you named the Iron Reach girl tonight, half your border trouble would be over by spring. I know what the Iron Reach would buy me, I said. And yet you look like a man who'd rather buy nothing. I did not answer him, because there was nothing to say that would not sound mad. That I would rather stand here in the cold and watch a nameless woman set a stranger's arm than sit warm on my throne and choose the queen who would end my wars. That the sight of her small, sure hands did something to the ache in my chest that 3 winters of jewels and curtsies had not touched. A king does not say such things to his captain. A king chooses the alliance and buries the ache and calls it duty. Below us, the crowned champion Baal raised his fists and turned a slow circle so all the packs could see him, and the crowd bellowed his name, and he grinned up at me with all his teeth. He was everything the songs wanted, huge, golden, unbeaten, his pack's colors bright at his throat. He was also, I would learn before the moon was full again, a small man in a large body, the kind who mistakes the fear of others for their love. At his feet, one of the men he had beaten in an earlier round still lay on the ice where he had been dragged clear, and the healer in gray was already there, her knee in the snow, her hands moving. She did not look up at the crowned man. She did not look up at me. She looked at the wound, and only the wound, as if the whole roaring circus of us did not exist and there was only ever this, the broken thing in front of her and the mending of it. I made my decision then, though I did not yet know it was a decision. "I'm going down," I said. Havar's eyebrows climbed into his snow-wet hair. "Down, among my people," I said. "A king can walk among his people." I went down the timber steps and out onto the churned edge of the field, and the crowd's roar changed shape around me, surprise, then delight, then a wave of it rippling outward as pack after pack realized the Alpha King himself had left his high seat and was walking among them in the snow. Champions straightened. Daughters of great houses adjusted their hoods and their smiles. Baal turned toward me with his arms spread, sure I was coming to praise him. I walked past him. I heard the crowd's noise stumble. I heard Baal's grin curdle. I did not care. I walked the long curve of the field's rim toward the gray figure kneeling over the fallen fighter, and with every step my wolf grew quieter and more certain, the way the world grows quiet before snow. She still did not look up. She had the man's forearm braced across her knee, and she was feeling along the bone with 2 fingers, her head bent, a loose dark braid falling over her shoulder. "Don't move it," she was telling him low. "It's cracked, not broken through. If you're still, it knits clean. If you're proud, you lose the arm. Which will it be?" Still, the man breathed ashen. "Good man." And then, without turning, without ever having looked to see who cast it, she said to the shadow that had fallen across her work, "You're in my light." The whole field seemed to catch its breath. I heard someone gasp, some lord who had recognized me and understood, before she did, exactly whose light she had just claimed. I looked down at the top of her bent head, at the snow melting in her dark hair, and for the first time in 3 long winters something in my chest came loose and warm, and I did the last thing anyone on that field expected. I stepped aside out of her light. "Better?" I asked. She stilled. I watched the understanding go through her, the voice, the cut of the shadow, the sudden held breath of 1,000 people. She finished the wrap around the fighter's arm first. She tied it off. Only then did she lift her face and look at me, and I forgot the cold and the crown and the moon and every proud stranger who had ever curtsied to my throne. Her eyes were gray as the wool she wore, gray as the winter sky, and they held no fear of me at all. That was the thing that undid me. Not beauty, though she was lovely in the plain, unpainted way of a woman who has never once been told she is worth looking at. It was that she met the eyes of the Alpha King of the Greywater packs with the same steady, level care she had given the broken arm, as if I too were only a thing set before her, to be seen clearly and dealt with honestly, no more and no less. "Sire," she said, and began to rise. "No," I crouched instead, down into the snow with her, and the gasp that went around the field this time was a different thing entirely. "Finish. He needs you more than I do." For a moment she only looked at me, and I could not read what moved behind those gray eyes. Then she turned back to her patient, and I stayed there in the slush beside her, a king on his knees among the wounded, and I watched her work, and I did not care one whit what the packs made of it. "What's your name?" I asked quietly so only she would hear. "Neve," she said, not looking up. "And your pack, Neve?" Her hands did not slow, but something in her went carefully still, the way a deer goes still. "I have none, sire. I follow the fighting. I mend what it breaks." "Everyone has a pack." "Not everyone." She helped the fighter to sit, guided his good arm around a waiting friend's shoulders, murmured her last instructions, and only when he had been led away did she finally sit back on her heels and face me fully. Up close her face was chapped with cold, and there was a smear of another man's blood along her jaw, and I thought I had never in all my life seen anything I wanted so badly to protect. "You should go back to your seat, sire," she said, not unkindly. "You're frightening the great houses. They came a long way to be looked at, and you're looking at a bone setter instead." "Let them be frightened," I said. "It's the most honest most of them have felt in years." And God help me, she almost smiled. The fighting ran until the moon was high, and I did go back to my seat, because a king who abandons the whole trial to sit in the snow with a healer starts a fire he cannot put out, not yet, not before I understood what I was doing. But I watched her the rest of that day, and I did not choose a Luna by moonrise. When my council came to me with their soft, urgent voices and their list of great daughters, I told them the trial had 2 more days to run, and I would not be hurried into the most important choice of my reign, and I let them think me stubborn, and I sent them away. That night, when the field had emptied and the lords had gone to their warm pavilions to drink and boast, I could not sleep. So I did what kings are not supposed to do. I wrapped myself in a plain fur with the hood up, and I walked out alone into the healer's camp at the field's far edge, where the fires were small and the people were poor, and no one was performing for anyone. I found her by the last fire, alone, grinding something bitter-smelling in a stone bowl. "You'll ruin the hood pretending," she said, without turning around. "Half the North knows your walk, sire. You move like a man who's used to the crowd parting." I lowered the hood. "You knew it was me the whole day, on the field, when you told me I was in your light. I knew someone tall had stepped between me and the moon." Now she did look up, and the small fire put gold in her gray eyes. "I didn't know it was the king until you didn't move. Kings don't step out of a servant's light, so either you weren't a king or you were a very strange one." "And which did you decide?" "I haven't decided." She went back to her grinding. "Sit if you're going to loom, you'll frighten the pot." I sat. A king on a healer's log at a beggar's fire, and I have never in my life been more at ease. For a while neither of us spoke. The camp slept around us. Somewhere a wounded man moaned in his dreams, and she tipped her head toward the sound, tracking it the way a mother tracks a child's breathing, and when it settled she relaxed again. "You never rest," I said. "I rest when they do." She nodded at the dark shapes of the sleeping camp. "Someone has to keep the fire warm for the ones who wake in the night hurting. Might as well be me. I sleep light anyway." "Why?" She was quiet a moment. "I learned young that it's safer to sleep light." There was a whole history in that sentence, and I had the sense of her closing a door on it, gently but firmly, before I could see inside. I did not push. Instead, I looked at her hands, red and cracked from a day in the snow, and without letting myself think about it, I reached out and took the near one in both of mine and held it toward the fire's warmth. She went utterly still. "Your hands are frozen," I said. "You spend all day mending everyone but yourself." For a long moment she let me hold her hand, and I felt the fine tremor in it, not fear, I thought, but the shock of being tended to by someone, of being the one seen for once instead of the one seeing. Then quietly she drew it back. "You mustn't, sire," she said, and her voice was steadier than her hand had been. "Whatever this is, I know how these stories go for women like me. The king is kind for a night, and then the moon rises on his wedding to a great man's daughter, and the camp healer packs her bowl and follows the next fight to the next field. I've watched it happen to better women than me. I won't be a story that ends that way. What if I told you, I said slowly, that in 3 winters of great daughters my wolf has not once lifted its head, and that the moment I saw you kneeling in the snow, it stood up and would not lie back down? She looked at me for a long, long moment across the little fire. Then I'd tell you, she said at last, very low, that you should be careful what your wolf knows about me. Because there are things about me, sire, that the great houses would burn me for, and a king who stood too close might burn with me. I felt my wolf surge, not in fear, in fierce refusal, a heat that ran the whole length of my spine. Then tell me, I said, tell me the thing they'd burn you for, and let me be the judge of what burns in my own kingdom. But she shook her head and rose and banked the fire, and the shutter came down over those gray eyes. Not tonight, she said. Maybe not ever. Go back to your pavilion, sire. Choose your queen. Let me be the woman who fixed a few arms at your great trial and then went on down the road. It's kinder. Truly it is. I went, but I did not sleep, and I did not choose, and all night my wolf paced behind my ribs and would not be still. The second day of the trial I could not keep my eyes from her, and neither, I began to notice, could someone else. Baal of the Ironreach had won his bracket the day before, and a man like Baal, when he has won everything a field can offer, begins to look for the one thing that has not yet knelt to him. He had seen the king leave his high seat and cross the whole trial ground to kneel beside a nameless healer. He had felt the crowd's attention swing away from his crown of laurel toward that strange, quiet moment in the snow, and it had eaten at him all night. So on the second day, between his bouts, I watched Baal of the Ironreach begin to circle Neve's healing fire, and I did not like the way he circled. I was too far to hear the first words. But I saw her rise from a patient and put herself between the wounded man and the champion, and I saw her chin come up, and I saw Baal laugh, a big, performing laugh, thrown out to the watchers so they would gather. A crowd began to knot around them, scenting sport. I was already moving. No pack, no name, no house to answer for you, Baal was booming as I came within earshot, playing to the ring of onlookers. And yet the Alpha King crawls through the snow to you like a whipped pup. What did you feed him, girl? What did you slip in his cup? Because it wasn't your face and it wasn't your blood, that's certain. He turned to the crowd. 200 years the Rite's been dark. But a king can still be turned by a clever campwitch with a warm bowl and a soft word, eh? The word which landed in the crowd, and I felt it catch and spread, ugly and eager. I saw Neve's face go carefully blank, and I understood at once that this was the fire she had spoken of. This was the thing they burned women for, out here on the edges where no king was watching. A woman with too much skill in her hands and no house behind her. A woman a powerful man had noticed. That was all it took. Champion. My voice cut across the ring, and the crowd broke open before me, and Baal turned and had at least the sense to lose some of his grin. You've won your laurel. Wear it. It does not give you leave to name my subjects witches on my ground. Sire. He inclined his head, but his eyes were bright and reckless with 3 winters of being the strongest thing in every room he entered. I only spoke what half the field is thinking. A king with the whole North's daughters before him, and he kneels to a healer nobody. Either you're bewitched, sire, or you've a taste none of us understood. Which is it? The insolence of it stole the breath from the crowd. I felt my wolf come up snarling, and I let it show in my face, and I watched Baal's certainty flicker. But before I could answer him, before I could do the thing a king should not do and strike down his own champion in front of the packs, Neve stepped forward. It's neither, she said, and her voice was clear and carrying, and it silenced them better than any snarl of mine. She looked at Baal without a scrap of fear. There's no witchery in me, champion. There's no potion. If the king is kind to me, it's because I've mended 100 of your men these 2 days while you strutted, and a good king notices who does the quiet work. But you don't want an answer. You want a reason to be cruel to something that can't strike back. I've met a great many of you. You're all the same size on the inside. The crowd made a sound like a struck drum, and Baal, humiliated in front of everyone by a healer in gray wool, did the thing that small men in large bodies do. He lost himself. His hand came up. I was 3 strides too far. But he never landed the blow. Because as his hand rose, something happened that would be told in the North for 100 years. The old Rite basin, the dead black bowl of stone that had held nothing but snow for 2 centuries, went from cold and dark to a light so sudden and so silver that the whole field cried out and shielded its eyes. It was not fire. It was moonlight, but gathered, as if every beam that had ever fallen into that basin over 200 empty years had been waiting, saved up, for one moment, and poured out all at once. The silver climbed the walls of snow. It ran along the trampled ground, and it ran unmistakably in a single bright river straight toward the woman in gray. The whole field went to its knees, not by any command. The wolves went first, every champion's wolf, every lord's, the great gray shapes that had stood in ranks behind their masters all through the trial. Every one of them dropped and lowered its head toward Neve as if a hand had pressed them down. And then the men followed, the way men do when the world tips and they must find something to hold to. Packs that had feuded for a century knelt shoulder to shoulder in the snow. Baal's raised hand hung forgotten in the silver light, and then it fell, empty, to his side, and he stared. And his face was the face of a man who has just understood he was about to strike the moon. And Neve stood in the middle of it, in the river of silver, and I saw her close her eyes, and I saw the thing she had hidden her whole life rise to the surface at last. On the skin of her throat, where the loose collar of her gray wool had fallen open, a mark came up out of her flesh like breath fogging cold glass. It was the shape of a crescent moon, silver as the light, and it glowed. I had seen it drawn in the oldest books in Dunkero's vaults, in the histories no one read anymore, the moon mark of the first Luna, the sign the Rite had been built in the beginning to seek. Not a mark of skill, a mark of blood. The blood of the woman the first Alpha had loved, from whom every true Luna was meant to descend, lost so long ago that we had turned the finding of her into a myth, and then forgotten even that. The Rite had not chosen a champion in 200 years, because no champion had ever carried what it was looking for. It had only ever been looking for her. I crossed the ground into the silver. The light did not burn. It was cool as snowmelt, and it wrapped us both, and when I reached her she had opened her eyes and there were tears standing in them. Not of joy, I understood, but of terror, the old bone-deep terror of a woman who has spent her whole life hiding the one thing that made her hunted. "They'll burn me now for certain," she whispered, so low only I could hear. "You don't understand, sire. This is why I have no pack. This is why I sleep light. When I was a child, the ones who took me in saw this mark and they were afraid, and they gave me to the road so it wouldn't fall on their house. Everyone who has ever seen it has been afraid of me. Everyone." Neve. I took her face in my 2 hands there in the silver light, before the kneeling packs and my own kneeling wolves and the whole staring north. "Look at me. Look at what your gods just did to 200 years of dark." She looked. "You have spent your whole life," I said, "being the reason everyone was afraid. Let me be the first thing in all your years that is not afraid of you. Let me be that, and I will spend the rest of mine making certain you never sleep light again." The tears fell. And she, this woman who had knelt in the blood and snow for 2 days mending strangers, who had faced down my strongest champion without a tremor, who had refused a king's kindness at a beggar's fire, because she thought herself a story that ends badly. She reached up and covered one of my hands with hers, and her hand was no longer shaking. "The great houses will fight you," she said. "A Luna out of the road, out of the healer's camp, with no name to answer for her. They'll call it madness. Some of them will call it worse. Let them." I lifted my voice so the whole field would hear it, and the silver light seemed to carry it out over the walls of snow. The Rite has spoken, and the Rite does not lie, and it has not spoken in 200 years. 200 years my line has ruled without the blessing this basin was built to give, and every one of you has felt the north grow thin and afraid without it. Here is your true Luna, not chosen by a king's whim, chosen by the oldest law in the world before any of us were born to break it. I looked at the kneeling ranks, at the Pax who had come to sell me their daughters, at the lords who would have named a healer a witch an hour ago. The first man to raise his hand or his voice against her raises it against the moon that just answered us. Are there any who would like to be that man? There were none. I found Baal in the crowd on his knees like the rest, his crown of laurel fallen off into the snow, his golden face gray. I walked to him. He flinched, expecting the blow he had earned. I did not strike him. You were about to strike the true Luna of the Greywater Pax, I said quietly, so that only the nearest could hear, and mercy is sometimes crueler than rage. The Rite saw what you are before it saw what she is. You'll carry that the rest of your life, champion, and that's punishment enough. Pick up your laurel. You won it fairly. And the next time you find something small enough to be cruel to, remember whose face you almost struck, and be a better man than the one who raised his hand today. I left him there in the snow with his crown, and I have heard he was a better man after, though a quieter one. Sometimes the mercy is the sentence. We did not wed by moonrise. I would not have Neve made a queen the way the trial had tried to make her a prize chosen quick, to settle a border to please a council. I took her back to Dunkero first, and I gave her a winter to become sure of me, and of the walls, and of herself as something other than the woman who sleeps light. My council did fight me at the first, exactly as she had warned. They came with their soft, urgent voices and their lists, and they spoke of the Iron Reach and the border and the great daughters, and I let them speak, and then I asked them one question. When the Rite lit, I said, did any of you stay on your feet? Not one of them had. Not one lord in all the north had kept his feet before that silver light. And a man who has knelt to something cannot easily argue that it is a mistake, so the council grumbled and adjusted, the way councils do, and by the first thaw they were competing with each other to be the one who had always known. The great houses did not all love it, some of them never will, but a strange thing happened that spring, and it was the truest proof of who she was. The mark on her throat, once it had been seen, did not make people afraid. It made them come. Word went out through the north that the true Luna had been found, that she had risen out of the healer's camp with mending in her hands, and the sick and the broken began to make their way to Dunkero's gates the way they had once made their way to the old shrines. And Neve, who had spent her whole life kneeling in the snow for strangers with nothing, did not stop kneeling when she became a queen. She only did it now with the warmth of a great hall at her back, and my hand on her shoulder, and no need, ever again, to sleep light for fear of who might see her in the dark. I asked her once late, on the night before I finally made her my queen before all the Pax, whether she had known down the years, on all those cold roads, what the mark meant, and why she carried it. No, she said. She was sitting at our hearth with her knees drawn up, the firelight on the crescent at her throat that she no longer hid. I only knew it made people leave me on the road. I never once thought it meant I was owed anything. I thought it meant I was owed nothing. She looked at me, and the old terror was gone from her gray eyes, and something steadier had grown up in its place. I don't think that's why the Rite chose me, Torin. Not the blood. Any child can carry blood. I think it waited 200 years because it wasn't only looking for the first Luna's line. It was looking for someone who would still kneel in the snow for a stranger even after the whole world had taught her she was worth nothing. That's the harder thing to find. That's what took 200 years. I have thought about that many times since, in all the good years that followed, through the border wars that ended because the North was whole again, through the winters that came and went with the hall full and warm, through the mornings I woke to find her already gone down to the gates to tend whoever had come in the night. I have thought that she was right. The Rite was not looking for blood. Blood is easy. It was looking for the woman who was in my light and did not flinch, who held a king's frozen hand toward the fire and then drew back her own rather than be a story that ended badly. She was never a story that ended badly. She was the ending 200 years of my line had been waiting for. And on the nights the wind comes down cold off the northern snow and rattles the shutters of Dunkero, I still sometimes wake in the dark by old habit and reach for her. And she is always there, sleeping deep and unafraid beside me, the crescent softlit at her throat, the woman no champion could have won and no house could have bought, who a dead old bowl of stone remembered when the whole living world had forgotten to look. I step out of no one's light any more except hers. For her, I would darken every hall in the kingdom, just to watch that silver rise. The old fire was silver in my memory, but the morning after the Rite woke, it was politics that filled Dunkero's great hall, and politics has never once knelt to a miracle without trying to bargain with it first. I had known this was coming. I had told Neve it would come, that first night in the tower room I gave her, with a real bed and a bolted door and a hearth she did not have to tend for anyone but herself. She had stood at the narrow window looking out at the snowlit courtyard as if she did not quite trust the walls to still be there in the morning, and I had said, "Tomorrow they'll come for me with reasons." Every lord in the north will have a reason why the Rite made a mistake, or why it doesn't mean what it plainly meant, or why the Ironreach girl would still make the safer queen. I want you to know it before they say it, so that when you hear it, you'll know I heard it first and it changed nothing. And if it did change something, she'd asked, not turning from the window. If I stood between you and the whole North, and the whole North said choose the alliance or lose the border, what then, Torin? A man can mean a thing at midnight and unmean it by the council's noon. Then you'd have learned what I'm worth, I'd said, and you'd be right to pack your bowl and go. But you won't have to. I've had 3 winters of the safe choice standing in front of me in silk. I know exactly what it's worth, and it isn't worth the look on your face when the Rite lit and you thought I would be afraid of you like all the rest. She had turned from the window then. You weren't afraid. No. Everyone is afraid. I'm the Alpha King of the Greywater Packs, I'd said. My whole life is being the thing other men are afraid of. Do you know how rare it is, how good it is, to find the one soul in the North who looks at me the way you looked at that cracked arm, like I'm just a thing to be seen clearly and dealt with honestly? I would fight the whole council for that. I'd fight the whole North. And I'd meant it, and I think she'd half believed me, which from a woman who slept light was nearly everything. So when the morning came, I was ready for them. They filed into the great hall in their winter furs, the lords of the packs who had come for the trial and stayed for the aftermath, the Ironreach chief with his jaw set, the Stormfell elders, the 12 houses of the near north who between them held every road and river that mattered. Havar stood at my shoulder. And down the long hall, on the dais where Aluna's seat had stood empty for 200 years, I had set a chair for Neve, and I had asked her to sit in it, and she had looked at me as if I'd asked her to sit on a lit stove. "They'll hate me more for sitting," she'd said. "They'll respect you less for hiding," I'd answered. "You knelt in the snow in front of the whole North and stared down my strongest champion. Don't let a room full of frightened lords be the thing that finally makes you flinch." She'd sat, gray-wool still, because she owned nothing else, and I had not yet insulted her by dressing her like a doll, straight-backed, the crescent soft at her throat where the fallen collar showed it, because I had asked her not to hide that either. And I watched 12 pack lords come into my hall braced to argue a king out of a madness, and I watched every one of them falter when their eyes found that Mark and their own knees remembered the night before. The Ironreach chief spoke first, because a man whose son has been shamed always speaks first. "Sire, Torvald of the Ironreach was a bull of a man, gray now but still broad as a door, and he had come to the trial certain he would leave it as the king's new father by marriage. No one denies what the Rite did. I felt my own legs go out from under me, and I'll not pretend otherwise. But Aluna is not only a blessing, sire. She is a treaty. She is the peace between houses. For 200 years your line has managed without the Rite's blessing by managing the marriage instead, binding the great packs to the throne through the Luna's blood. You'd throw that away for. And here he had the sense to choose his word, with the crescent glowing not 10 feet from him, for a woman with no house to bind. That's the argument, I said. I'll answer it, but first I'll let her answer it because she's cleverer than both of us and it's her house you're worried about. The hall stirred. A king does not hand the floor to a Luna before she's even crowned, not to answer his own lords. I did it on purpose. I wanted them to see her think. Neve did not stand. She let them come to her, the way she'd let the wounded come to her fire. Lord Torvald, she said. You're right, I have no house to bind. The Ironreach girl would have bought you a treaty. I understand treaties, I've stitched up enough men who were broken making them and breaking them. So let me offer you something a treaty can't. She leaned forward slightly. A treaty binds 2 houses. The moment there are 3, it strains, and the moment one house grows and another shrinks, it snaps, and then you have a border war, and then I stitch up your sons. I've done it for 20 years. I have set the bones of Ironreach men and Stormfell men and men of houses I never learned the names of, and I will tell you a thing I learned kneeling in all that blood. Not one of them was fighting for a treaty. They were fighting because their fathers taught them the house across the river was the enemy, and no marriage treaty ever untaught it. Torvald's jaw worked, and you'd unteach it a camp healer. I already have, she said, to a few hundred men. You want to know why the wounded of a dozen feuding packs let a no-pack woman set their bones without a knife at her back? Because when a man is bleeding, he stops caring whose color I wear. He only cares that I don't leave him. That's the peace you can't marry your way into, Lord. It has to be built one kept promise at a time. A Luna with no house owes no house, which means for the first time in 200 years, the North will have a Luna who belongs to all of you equally, and to none of you against the rest. I'm not the safe choice. I'm the only choice that doesn't have a side. I watched it land. I watched Torvald of the Ironreach, who had come to lose a daughter's marriage and take it as an insult, sit with the strange new shape of an argument he had not expected, that a Luna who belonged to no house might belong, in a way no bride ever had, to all of them. It did not win him over in a breath. Men like Torvald are not won in a breath. But I saw the anger go out of him and the thinking come in, and thinking in a council is the whole of the war. Pretty words, said a thinner voice, Aldous of Stormfell, an old man with a long feud in his blood. But words don't hold a border. What holds a border, girl, when the Rite's silver fades and the winter's hard, and some young Ironreach hothead decides your peace is weakness? What holds it then? And here was the thing I had not planned, the thing that showed me I had chosen better than even the Rite knew. Neve smiled, not the wary half-smile she'd given me at the fire, but something with iron under it. The same thing that held it last night, Lord Aldous. Fear of the moon, you knelt. Your wolves knelt. Not to me, to what chose me. 200 years you've all told yourselves the old law was dead, and last night it stood up in front of the whole North and reminded you it was only sleeping. Your young hotheads felt it too. There isn't a wolf in the North this morning that doesn't know the Rite is awake again and watching. You want to know what holds the border? She sat back. The oldest law you'd all forgotten to be afraid of just woke up. Don't waste it arguing with me. Use it. The hall was silent. And then old Aldous of Stormfell, who had come into that room my enemy on this matter, did a thing I will remember to my last day. He laughed, a dry, surprised bark of a laugh, and he said, Sire, I came here to tell you you'd lost your wits over a healer. I'll be going home to tell them you found something the rest of us had misplaced. The gods help the man who tries to feud under a waking Rite. Feud under a waking Rite, and you'll have her at your enemy's bedside and the moon at your back. He inclined his head toward the dais. Luna. It was the first time any lord of the North had named her so. It would not be the last. They did not all bend that morning. 2 houses left cold, and one of them would give me trouble before the year was out. But that is a later part of the tale, and it ended, as such things do under a Rite that no longer sleeps, with a proud house learning the cost of standing against the moon. What mattered that morning was that the argument I had braced for, The argument that a woman had warned me might cost me my crown. She had won for me from a chair, in borrowed gray wool, before she was even a queen. When the hall had emptied, I went to her, and she was pale under the straight back, and her hands, when I took them, were cold again. "You were magnificent," I said. "I was terrified," she said. "I've faced down drunk soldiers with knives, and I was never as frightened as I was of that room." "I know, that's what magnificent is." I chafed her hands warm the way I had at the beggar's fire, and this time she let me and did not draw back. "You didn't tell me you could do that." "Do what?" "Take a room full of men who came to unmake you, and send them home carrying your argument like it was their own idea." She looked at our joined hands. "I've spent 20 years watching powerful men decide the fate of women like me over our heads," she said quietly. "You learn to read them. You learn what they're really afraid of under what they say they want. Lord Torvald wasn't afraid of losing a treaty. He was afraid of being made small, his son shamed, his daughter passed over. So I gave him a way to be large again. The man who saw first that a houseless Luna was the wiser piece. Aldous wasn't afraid of the border. He was afraid the old world he grew up in was gone for good. So I gave it back to him, told him the law he mourned was only sleeping." She shrugged, a small, tired motion. "It's the same as setting a bone, Torin. You don't force it. You find where it wants to go, and you guide it there, and you hold it while it knits. I have ruled a long time now, and I have sat through 1,000 councils, and I have never heard statecraft explained better than by a camp healer who called it bone setting. I think that was the hour I stopped being merely undone by her, and started, in the slow way of a man who has been alone too long, to trust her, which is the deeper thing, and the rarer. The winter I gave her to become sure of me was the making of us both. I had feared she would wilt inside walls. A woman who has followed the fighting for 20 years, who sleeps light and owns one bowl, does not always thrive when the roof stops leaking and the door finally locks from the inside. For the first week she moved through Dunkero like a guest braced to be asked to leave, rising before the servants, unable to sit idle, flinching from soft things as if comfort were a trick that would be taken back. I did not push her toward the throne. I did the opposite. I let her be a healer. I gave her the old infirmary that had fallen to storerooms, and I had it cleared and fired and stocked, and I let the word go out that the true Luna kept a healing hall at Dunkero's gate. And they came, as I said before, they came, the sick and the broken of a dozen packs, and some who were no pack at all, the road people she had lived among, who would never in 100 years have dared Dunkero's gate for a highborn Luna but dared it for one of their own. She knelt for every one of them. Queen's chair by day, if the council needed her. The healing hall by evening, on her knees in clean rushes now instead of bloody snow, but the same steady hands, the same refusal to leave a hurting thing alone. And a thing happened that no treaty could have bought me. The road people, the packless, the ones the great houses had never once counted, they began to love her. And through her, in the strange sideways manner of these things, they began to love the throne that had raised her up. For 200 years my line had ruled the great packs and forgotten there was a whole other north beneath them, the healers and the tinkers and the herd drivers who followed no color. Neve gave me that north, not by policy, by kneeling. I fell in love with her slowly, over that winter, which I am glad of. The Rite had chosen us in a single silver instant, but I did not want to be a man who loved only what the moon had handed him. I wanted to love her the ordinary way, the earned way, for the wry thing she said over the evening meal, for the way she still tracked every distant sound of pain in the keep and could not rest until she knew its cause, for the night I found her asleep at last in a chair by the infirmary fire, deeply, heavily asleep, not the light sleep of the hunted, but the bottomless sleep of someone who has finally, for the first time in her life, believed that the door will hold. I stood in the doorway a long while that night and did not wake her. I only watched her sleep unafraid, and I understood that I would spend the rest of my life keeping the door held, and that it was the truest work my crown had ever been put to. She came to trust me the same slow way. There was no single moment. There was the accumulation of 100 small ones. The council I let her win, the infirmary I gave her without asking anything back, the great daughters I sent home unmarried without a backward glance, the night she woke from an old nightmare of the road and found me sitting up in the dark keeping watch so that she would not have to, and I said, "Sleep. I've got the door tonight." And she looked at me for a long moment and then, wonder of wonders, she slept. "You never ask me what happened," she said one evening near the thaw. We were at the hearth in the tower room that had become ours. On the road, before, everyone who ever kept me wanted the story, wanted to know what a marked girl had done to deserve the marking. You never ask. "Do you want me to?" "No," she was quiet. "That's why I'm telling you, because you'd have let me carry it alone forever rather than make me open the door before I chose to." She drew a breath. "I was 3 when the house that took me in found the mark. They weren't cruel exactly. They were afraid. There was a bad winter and a sickness, and someone said the marked child had drawn it, and rather than fight the whole village they put me on a herder's cart going south and told the herder I was an orphan of the sickness. I was 3. I don't remember their faces. I remember the cart." She looked at the fire. "After that it was always the same. Someone would take me in and I'd be useful. I learned early to be useful, to be worth keeping. And then someone would see the mark and the fear would come and I'd be back on a road. By the time I was grown, I stopped waiting to be put out. I just kept moving on my own ahead of the fear, and I learned to heal because a healer is always welcome for exactly as long as someone is hurt and never one day longer." She turned to me. "So when you knelt in the snow beside me and didn't move out of my light like a servant but stepped out of it like I was owed the light, I didn't know what to do with it. I'd never once been owed anything. I'd only ever been worth keeping until I wasn't." I took her hand. "You were never worth keeping until you weren't," I said. "You were worth keeping. Every house that put you out on a road was a house too small to hold what it had been given. That's their poverty, Neve, not yours. The Rite waited 200 years because there was no one worth waking for, and then a marked girl who'd been thrown off a dozen carts knelt in the snow for a stranger anyway, and the moon that had been silent since my great-great-grandfather's day stood up and said, 'There, that one, I've been waiting for that one.'" I lifted her hand to my mouth. "You weren't worth keeping. You were worth 200 years of waiting. There's a difference, and I mean for you to feel it every day I have left." She wept then, not the terror tears of the trial ground, but something older and deeper draining out of her. 20 years of being always ahead of the fear, and I held her while it went, and when it was done she was lighter, and she slept that night the bottomless sleep, and I held the door. We wed at the first full moon of spring, before all the packs, on the silver ground where the Rite had woken. I had thought a long while about where. The council wanted Dunkero's great hall, all gold and banners, a proper king's wedding. But I remembered the snow-ringed trial ground and the silver river of light, and I knew there was only one place in the whole north to do this thing, and it was the place the moon itself had chosen. So the packs came back, the same lords, the same champions, minus one crown of laurel that had been carried home by a quieter man, and they stood again in the great ring, though the snow was melting now and the ground was green at the edges. And the old Rite basin, which had gone dark again after that first miracle as an old thing does when its great work is done, sat waiting in the center. I had wondered in the small hours whether it would light again. Whether the miracle had been a single spending of 200 years saved silver, never to be repeated. I had not told Neve I wondered. But she knew, of course she knew. She read me the way she read a wounded man, and on the morning of the wedding she said, "If it stays dark, Torin, it changes nothing. It already chose. It doesn't have to keep choosing to have been right." "I know," I said. "Do you?" "I know it about you," I said. "I'm less sure the North knows it about you. A dark basin at your wedding, after a silver one at your trial, there are 2 houses who'd make a great deal of that." She only smiled and took my arm, and we walked out onto the green and white ground together before the whole assembled North. I will not pretend I was easy. I spoke the old words, the vows my line had spoken over 200 years of lunaless weddings, the words that had always felt to me like a prayer recited over an empty altar. And Neve spoke hers, clear and steady, in the gray wool she had finally let me trade for a gown the pale silver of moonlight, the crescent bright at her throat for all to see. And when the vows were done, in the old rite of it, the bride crosses the basin, a hollow gesture, for 200 years, a queen stepping over a cold cup of stone while everyone pretended not to remember it had once meant something. Neve crossed the basin, and the silver rose. Not the flood of the trial ground, not the desperate, saved-up outpouring of 2 centuries loosed all at once. This was gentler. This was a basin that had woken for good and no longer needed to shout. The silver climbed up out of the black stone soft as breath, and it wrapped her feet, and it climbed the pale silver of her gown until she stood ankle-deep in moonlight with the crescent glowing warm at her throat, and the whole North saw that the first miracle had been no single spending. The Rite was awake. The Rite would stay awake. For as long as she lived and any child of her blood lived after her, the North would have its moon back. The Pax knelt, but it was different this time. I felt the difference in it. The first time they had knelt in shock, thrown down by a thing too large to stand against. This time they knelt the way people kneel to something they have come to love, slowly, gladly, of their own weight. And the 2 cold houses knelt with the rest, and I saw the moment the last of their scheming went out of them, because you cannot plot against a thing the whole world is gladly kneeling to. That is a peace no marriage treaty ever bought a king. She had told Torvald as much in the hall months before. The oldest law you'd forgotten to be afraid of just woke up. Don't waste it. Use it. And here it was, using itself, kneeling my whole fractious North down into one green ring of quiet. I took her hand there in the silver. You crossed it without flinching, I said low for her alone. I've been crossing cold basins my whole life, she said, and her gray eyes were wet and laughing at once. This is the first one that lit. I have thought since that this was the truest thing anyone said in all those days. She had spent 20 years stepping over cold altars, every house that might have kept her, every hearth that might have been home, every promise that went dark before she reached it. And she had kept crossing anyway, kept kneeling in the snow for strangers anyway, kept believing the door might someday be worth trying even after 100 doors had shut. That is why the moon rose for her and not for a champion, not the blood. The crossing, the refusal after everything to stop crossing toward the light on the mere chance that one basin someday might light. The years since have been the good years, the full years, and there is not room in one telling for all of them. There were hard seasons, of course. The 2 cold houses gave me the trouble I'd foreseen. In the second winter, a border raid, a testing of the young peace, a lord who wagered that a houseless Luna meant a soft king. He wagered wrong, but it was not my sword that ended it in the end. It was that his own wounded came, when it was over, to Dunkero's healing hall, because the whole North knew by then that the true Luna would turn no hurt man from her fire whatever color he'd bled in. She set the bones of the men who'd raided us. And their lord, when he heard of it, sat a long time with the strange arithmetic of a queen who had healed his soldiers rather than let them die to spite him, and the fight went out of him the way it had gone out of Torvald in the hall, not beaten but reshaped. You cannot keep feuding with a house whose Luna keeps saving your sons. It unmakes the story the feud is built on. She untaught it, the way she'd told them she would, one kept promise at a time. There were children in the fullness of it, and I will say only that the crescent came up on the throat of our second, a girl in her 3rd winter, exactly as it had on her mother, and that no one put her out on any road. She grew up in a keep that loved the mark, that had knelt to the mark, that had made the mark the sign of the North's whole peace. She will never sleep light. She will never be worth keeping only until she isn't. Her mother saw to that, by crossing every cold basin of her own life until one of them lit, so that her daughter would be born into the light and never have to earn it on her knees in the snow. That is the thing Neve gave our line that no treaty and no champion ever could. Not blood. A birthright of not being afraid. Havar, who stood at my shoulder the morning the lords came to unmake her, lived to be very old, and near the end he said to me, "Do you remember, sire, when you walked down off your high seat at the trial and I thought you'd lost your mind, crossing the whole field to a healer nobody?" And I said I remembered. And he said, "I've decided it was the sanest thing you ever did. You were the only man on that field who could see her. The whole North was looking at champions, and you looked at the one who was doing the real work." He was quiet a moment. "The Rite chose her, sire, but you saw her first, before it lit. That's always seemed to me the part the songs get wrong. They sing that the moon chose the Luna. But the king chose her a whole night before the moon did, when there was nothing to gain by it, and a crown of alliances to lose. I've always thought the moon was only agreeing with you. I have thought about that too in the long quiet of these later years. I do not know if it's true. It may be that the Rite would have woken for her whether I'd walked down off my seat or not, that her worth was her own and needed no king to notice it first. I'd like to believe that. I'd like to believe she was always going to be found, that the moon had waited 200 years and would not have let a stubborn healer sleep light forever. But I am glad all the same that I did not wait for the moon. I am glad that when I saw a woman kneeling in the snow, doing the only honest work on a field full of vanity, I got up from my throne and crossed the whole cold ground to her before there was any silver to justify it. When she was still, to every other eye in the North, a nobody in gray wool who told a king he was standing in her light. I stepped out of her light that night because it was the decent thing, the human thing, and I have been rewarded for that one decent human choice with every good year since. The songs can say the moon chose her. Let them. I know the truer thing. I chose her in the dark before the fire. And she who had been thrown off a dozen carts and taught 100 times that she was worth keeping only until she wasn't. She looked up from a stranger's broken arm at the king who'd crossed a field to reach her, and decided, against everything her whole hard life had taught her, to let herself be seen. That was the miracle. The silver was only the moon agreeing. She sleeps deep beside me still, the crescent soft-lit at her throat, the woman no champion could win and no house could buy and no road could keep for long, because the road was never where she was going. She was always going to be found. And on the cold nights when the north wind rattles the shutters, I reach for her out of the old habit of a man who spent too many winters alone, and she is there, unafraid, and I hold the door, and I would darken every hall in the kingdom to watch that silver rise for her again. For her and for the girl asleep down the hall with her mother's moon at her throat, I keep the Rite awake. I keep the door held. I keep the light. It is the truest work my crown has ever been put to, and I would not trade it for every alliance in the North.